if she were to be elected, she will revert back to form. Open borders, no deterrence abroad, kind of radical Palestinian Iran, soft on crime.
Who do you think are more intelligent, Tim Walz and Kamala Harris, or J.D. Vance and Donald Trump?
So, I don't want to laugh, but based on their campaigns and their relative debates, I think that both Trump and Vance are far brighter than their counterparts. But more importantly, they're more industrious. And by that I mean that Kamala Harris does not prepare for anything. I don't think she's necessarily naturally limited, but she's intellectually lazy, and she always has been, because she counts on her race or her gender or her influence or her contacts or her mentors, and especially the press, that they won't press her. So then she just figures that whatever word salad she throws out there will be interpreted as deep or adequate or convincing. Waltz he was picked. It's kind of funny. I think Trump understood his limitations as far as expressing and analyzing, presenting the MAGA agenda. So he did kind of a unique thing in picking Vance, because by traditional electoral calculus, it made no sense. He's another white male. In America, we don't do that now. He's from a state, Ohio, that'll probably go Trump no matter what by 8 or 9 points. But he picked him because he's very articulate, and not just in formal presentations, but in repartee. And he goes on the talk shows, and he really goes mano to mano with the left, and he wins. And I think Trump knew that, and that displays a degree of confidence in Trump's ability to pick someone who's a better speaker than he is. And the opposite is true of Harris. She picked somebody who's not comfortable speaking. He won't meet the press. He doubles down on her reluctance to meet the media, and he's a force multiplier of her inabilities. And it just begs the question, why did she pick him? Because if Josh Shapiro had been on the stage, that's one of his fortes, is back and forth, and he's analytical. He's got about a 62% rating in Pennsylvania, whereas Minnesota is not going to be in play. I can't imagine that the Republicans could win it. So I don't know what he brought to the ticket at all.
Do you think that she picked him so that he wouldn't outshine her? Some people speculate that's why Biden was picked by Obama, for example.
Yeah, there's kind of a theme going around here in the United States this morning that Obama picked Biden because he was obviously mediocrity and wouldn't rival him. Biden picked Harris because she was more mediocre than Biden, and Harris picked Waltz for the same reason, and it's characteristic of this generation of Democrats. Whereas on the Republican side, I think you could make the argument that Pence was steadier, at least he was considered that way, than Trump, and that Vance was considered steadier than Trump as well. And so, yeah, that's what a lot of people have talked about.
Focusing on Kamala herself, do you think that she would be more dangerous than Joe Biden? How do you assess her as a presidential candidate, her intelligence, her qualifications for the job? Would she be the least qualified president in U.S. history?
Yeah, I think she would. But it's not a matter of controversy that she would be the most left-wing, because outside appraisal group surveys have shown that she's to the left of Bernie Sanders. We should remember in 2020, the powers that be removed Sanders from contention through a lot of machinations, precisely because he was considered too left-wing. Now, they didn't do that with Harris because she didn't last that long. She dropped out in December. But she was more of a socialist, according to these disinterested surveys, than was Sanders. And she's had to disown all of her socialist agendas in the last 90 days. So if she were to be elected, in fact, and even if she were to be defeated and to fulfill the last 3 months of her vice presidential tenure, she will revert back to form. Open borders, no deterrence abroad, kind of radical Palestinian Iran, soft on crime, New Green Deal, government picking and choosing, energy winners and losers, et cetera, controlled what she calls equity economy. This is all just a 90-day ruse. But she's a little bit more dangerous, to get to your original question, because Joe Biden has always been considered a buffoon, obnoxious, cruel. He dropped out of the 88 race, the 2008 race, because of the things he said. Said in 2008 that Barack Obama was the first black candidate could really speak, and no one else prior was articulate. He said he was clean in a way that other blacks had not been. He plagiarized Neil Kinnock's speech, as you remember, in 1988. So he had a history of just not impressive, and he has a history of racism too. I mean, he put you all back in slangs. You ain't black. Hey, junkie. Cozying up to Stennis and Thurman in the Senate. And so the point is that Joe Biden is not a very impressive character. She comes off silly, cackling, but more winningly to a lot of people, with therapeutic impulse. A lot of people think, well, she's young, she's attractive, she wants to be nice. Joe Biden now, in his senility, has that old man's grin. I don't know what it's not a grin, it's kind of a scowl. Get off my grass, who are you? And when he answers a question, he did the other day, they asked him about why he had only spent 2 hours. I have a dog here talking, but on the farm. But he scowls, and he just turned around and said, I've been on the phone for 2 hours. What was precisely the point? You haven't been out, and you won't go out, and you're equating 2 hours with micromanaging a natural catastrophe. So, and he gets angry. She doesn't do that, at least. So she's insipid, and she's kind of zany and sappy, but it explains the dislike for, I think a lot of people miss the visceral dislike of Joe Biden. People just didn't like him anymore. He was rude, he was cruel, he was snarled, and people thought, well, she's just such a welcome relief for our left-wing agenda. That begs another question is, if she loses, and she's hemorrhaging now, insidiously so, and after this debate, which usually wouldn't mean much, but it does in this abbreviated race, and after this longshoreman strike that may shut down the economy, and after the lethargic reaction to the Hurricane Helene, and after the blow up in the Middle East, and we should remember that Jake Sullivan said he inherited the quietest portfolio in the Middle East in 20 years from the Trump administration. There's going to be a lot of people ask, was it that smart to get rid of Joe Biden? Because at least he was a known quantity, and there was not this, and he was only, he was headed for defeat, but at the time he was actually removed in the Real Clear Politics aggregate, he was only about 2 points down. And I think she's going to hemorrhage with all these things that are happening right now. And in fact, the last 48 hours, some of the polls have shown that Donald Trump is now leading in Pennsylvania, leading in Georgia, leading even in Nevada and Arizona in a way that people didn't think that would be possible. So whatever bounce she's had has been stopped, and he's starting to make inroads. If he can just control his language, so when he says something like she's mentally impaired or that, it doesn't go down with the independent voter. So he's got to. He's on. I think all he has to do is play defense now, the way she is. She's got to play offense. That's why she's demanding another debate. And you can see last night, given that the moderators promised that they wouldn't fact check, promised they wouldn't be biased, and of course they introduced questions: healthcare, childcare, climate change, January 6th. These are all the issues that, while they're important, they do not rate anywhere near the economy and China and Ukraine war and the border. And they asked him for Vance for follow-up more than they did Walz. But most importantly, they promised not to fact check, and they fact check both wrongly and only Vance. And so it was a disaster for that genre of a disinterested debate. I think Trump was very smart to understand he's not going to do any more debates under those circumstances.
I want to stick with Kamala Harris's intelligence. They used to say that George H.W. Bush was a very dumb president. This was a very popular meme in America and in Britain. A lot of Britons were quite patronizing about that. Do you think that where do you sort of rank Kamala's intelligence amongst previous presidents? And do you think, that DEI, obviously that's come in to sort of the reason that she was chosen was partly because she was a woman and everything?
Before I answer that, remember that when that meme was voiced in Britain and the United States, that John Kerry was this shining aristocratic genius. The Bush campaign released the fact that their SAT scores, when they applied for college, Bush had a higher aggregate score than did Kerry, and that kind of shut them up. But when you look back at if we look back at the current presidents, I don't think Biden is any more impressive than she is. Like, she gets a pass with Biden, but Trump definitely has done things that require cunning and intelligence that she couldn't do. If you can imagine her at the head of a huge company in Manhattan dealing with unions and crooked officials and special interest groups and banks, she could not do that one day. If you go back further, obviously Obama was a far better rhetorician than she was. He couldn't pass a camera without turning around and being fixated by it. He wanted as much exposure, giving us confidence. He was far brighter than she was. I think if you go back a little further to George W. Bush, he was, everybody said he was tongue-tied, and that was true, he was, but he had natural intelligence. Sometimes he wasn't sophisticated, but he was not stupid. And Bill Clinton had a natural intelligence and superior rhetorical skills. So you go back 20 or 30 years and maybe 50 years, and you don't see anybody comparable to her. You can make the argument that J.D. Vance was only in the Senate 2 years and Obama was only in the Senate 2 years, so they shouldn't have classical experience, but they were so bright and so well-spoken that no one ever noticed that. But with her, she's been a city attorney, a county attorney, an attorney general, a senator, and a vice president, and seems like the more prerequisite position she gets, the worse she becomes. Is almost, I don't know how that's possible, but the thicker her resume, the less impressive it becomes.
But what about Reagan? I know that they also made the accusation against Reagan that he was dumb because he was an actor. And I know that a lot of Democrats at the time made this accusation that he just really wasn't smart.
Yeah, they did that, but they learned quickly that he was very smart, and they had forgotten that when in these cycles, people forget that Reagan ran 3 times for president. He actually tried to run in '68 against Nixon for a short time, and then he ran in, again, '76 against the incumbent Jerry Ford, and 1980. But in that 12-year period, he was on the radio. You would be driving, and I would be driving in the middle of nowhere, and all of a sudden up popped 1 or 2 minute commentaries that Reagan was doing for various venues. And he wrote them himself. And they were always to the point, succinct, persuasive, well-delivered. And when he ran the Screen Actors Guild, people really thought that he did a wonderful job. So he was highly intelligent. One thing that he did, I think that because he was at one point very charismatic, good-looking, he had a great memory, good actor, he didn't prep, and people said that he was lazy in the way that Obama said that he was lazy. And that's kind of a trait of people who have a natural knack, pick up things quickly, and their attitude is, I can get by without really prepping. And that was a criticism of Obama in his first debate with Romney when he completely bombed and people were writing him off. But he quickly adjusted and then boned up. Her problem is you would think that someone would sit her down and say, look, when they ask you why you haven't done this anything of your agenda for the last 3, and here is what you say. You say you support Joe Biden, but the vice president by statute does not have the opportunity to really take the initiative on these things that you will do as president. That's not to criticize Biden, but you obviously have different views within parameters. Or they could say, what are you going to do to the economy? And she could say, well, this is controversial, but I'm going to implement what I promised: wage and price controls, a wealth tax, a greater tax on corporate earnings, a greater tax on inheritance, and I'm going to do it in the first 90 days. I have a contract, something like that. But she doesn't. When you ask those questions to her, she says, I'm a middle-class kid, and I grew up in Oakland, which is not true, and I believe in an equity economy and a caring, a joy, and it's the same thing. So she plugs in these 7 or 8 canned replies, regardless of the topic that's addressed to her, and she can get by with the Philadelphia interview or the Dana Bash interview or the black journalist interview, or in isolation the Oprah interview or the Stephanie Rule interview. But what they don't understand is they insidiously, incrementally cement a picture that she's a lightweight, she's non-prepared, she's silly, she's not serious. And more importantly, each interviewer realizes that, and rather than fearing to be embarrassed by the T-ball, softball performance of their prior interviewers, they enhance that stereotype. They say, you know what, I'm the one that can be so obsequious that I will really make her look good, and that doesn't work. So now I think she's at the point that she's in a doom loop. She wants to debate Trump again. She knows she needs to get out more. She knows Waltz needs to get out more, but they know that the more they get out, the more they cement this reputation of being not serious and kind of amateurish and embarrassing. So it's going to be a very interesting last 30 days. If Trump can discipline himself and not get into the personal invective and stay with the issues, turn Vance loose on the talk shows on the weekend, and cut down his rallies, maybe because they expose him to a great deal of danger. And it's in his rallies that he says things. When he's in interviews, like he does very well, actually, in one-on-one interviews, Trump does. But I think you're going to see that Nevada, Georgia, Arizona, and probably Pennsylvania are going to solidify with a 1 to 2 point lead in most of the polls for Trump over the next 2 weeks. And that tells me that given the record of polling in 2020 and 2016, and the increase in Republican registration, that will offset any irregularities in the voting, and he, I think, will win the Electoral College.
I want to ask about the debate last night between J.D. Vance and Tim Walz. I just came from the White House interviewing American tourists, asking them who they thought won the debate. First of all, I was shocked by how many Americans had watched the debate, or just random people that I'd met. Pretty impressive that they're doing that. And second of all, everyone I spoke to were Democrats, and they all said that J.D. Vance won. They weren't persuaded by him, but they felt that he'd won that debate. What do you make of J.D. Vance as a figure? Are you impressed by him? Is he more impressive than, say, Mike Pence or Paul Ryan and other Republicans?
Absolutely. There were a lot of people, as I said, that criticized that debate. I have met him, and I've had long talks with him, and I've talked to him on the phone. Thing about him is he's kind of a Renaissance man. He grew up in Appalachia. He knows what poverty is. He went to Ohio State, and then he joined the Marine Corps. And, they faulted him for being a Marine Corps journalist, but I was in Iraq twice during the surge. There were no safe places in Iraq. Everything was a target. So he was in a combat zone. He goes back, he goes to Yale, he marries an Indian American. He writes a best-selling book. It's very hard to do with your first book. It was a bestseller for over a year. They make a movie out of him. The left just fawns over him as an authentic white critic of the pathologies of the white working class. Kind of goes to his head for a while, and then he realizes the more that he's in contact with the celebrities in Hollywood, coastal elite, the more he despises them. So then he looks back fondly on the pathologies of his upbringing. He says, you know what? It was authentic. And he starts to transform kind of in a reaction against hedge funds, Yale, all of that stuff. And he becomes a MAGA populist. And Trump is told by his children and the supporters that forget the traditional calculus of what makes a good vice president candidate. You need somebody that'll go head to head with these people and is fearless and can out debate them and doesn't come off as an elite. And this guy can do it. He's the only one that can do it. And he's loyal. So that was the argument for him. And I think anybody who's talked to him privately or been around him in private understands that that was his forte. I always thought, I was very worried about the Trump-Biden and the Trump-Harris debates. The first one, I think Trump was a bystander. He said he had a great debate, but it was really watching somebody pour water on the Wicked Witch of the East. I mean, he just imploded. Trump just was a bystander in a catastrophe. With Harris, he was more informative on the issues and had them better mastered, but she came out there to slur and smear him and got his goat, and he went kind of crazy on, minor issues like the attendance, people leaving early from his rallies. But on this particular debate, I had been asked, and I just knew that he was going. I didn't know how Waltz was going to get out of it, because it was clear to me that he would do two things. He would politely destroy Waltz, and then the second thing, he would dispel all of these smears and slurs against him, that he was mean, that he was crazy, that he was not a nice person. He's a very pleasant person, always has been. And so it was just, when I watched it, I just said to my wife who was watching with me, this is just the Vance we all knew. He's just a natural. And Waltz isn't. And I think a lot of people are saying, why didn't Kamala pick Josh Shapiro? He's a better debater. He's more popular. The state is far more important. He might have won Pennsylvania. She might have won Pennsylvania with him. And if Trump and Vance win, there's going to be a lot of questions asked. And one of them is going to be, did you really help yourself by having that coup and getting rid of Biden? He was much easier to keep out of the news than is Harris. And why in the world did you pick Waltz when you had these other choices that were superior? And I think you answered your own question when you said at the very initial that he was picked so he would make her look more impressive.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting speaking to those Democrats this morning, because I think their perception of J.D. Vance was very much created by the media, as you say, that he was mean and so on. And they were quite shocked at seeing him, live in a debate. And maybe their perception slightly changed on him, which was quite an interesting thing to see. How do you compare J.D. Vance to someone like Ron DeSantis? I'm thinking about the future of the right here beyond Trump. He's not going to be running next time. How optimistic are you about these figures like J.D. Vance, like Ron DeSantis? They're fairly young. The future of the Republican Party looks bright.
Well, at this point right now, Ron DeSantis has an advantage over J.D. Vance in the sense that he has actually taken a state and run it wonderfully for 4 years in every aspect of governance. And he's very popular. But as you saw in the primaries, Ron DeSantis is not a naturally charismatic figure. He's a technocrat, and he absolutely, in the second half of his debate, I felt, with Newsom, after he got over the Newsom kind of Kamala Harris can memorize lines, tore him apart systematically. But J.D. Vance is a different type of candidate. In other words, he's a naturally charismatic, he's well-spoken, he's relaxed, he's very confident, he doesn't get rattled. If he is vice president for 4 years, then he would have commensurate political experience with Ron DeSantis. And so I think he would have an advantage because he's more charismatic. But at this point, he needs more experience that DeSantis has. And I think those would be the two major figures. If Trump wins, I don't see Nikki Haley, given the questions about her MAGA fides and her kind of globalism, at least that's the criticism of her, becoming a major candidate again. If Trump loses, then there will be an enormous effort on the part of the old Republican establishment. I don't think it'll work, but they will try to reassert their authority and control of the party and look at somebody like Haley.
We were talking earlier about Kamala's intelligence. One of the people I find fascinating on the American political scene, or I suppose on the judicial scene really, is Justice Jackson. This is the Supreme Court pick from Joe Biden. How do you assess her as a member of the Supreme Court compared to her peers? I noticed that she's done a big interview with, I think, CBS, and they were advertising it last night on the debate. So how do you assess this Supreme Court pick? She's quite an interesting character.
They've only got 3 now, and when you look at Justice Kagan and Sotomayor, Sotomayor has always been an intellectual lightweight. She was the one that gave that ridiculous speech that she was a wise Latina and she would make a better judge because she had better experiences than white males. And she's prone to making just outrageous comments. She's not in good health. She's nearing an age where her medical problems are mounting. Kagan is she was the dean of Harvard Law School. She's kind of disappointed the left. She's not sort of one of these great left crusaders they've had in the past. And so people are looking at Miss Jackson as the new Earl Warren or William O. Douglas or Brennan or somebody like that, and she's not that way at all. She doesn't have the intellect. Thing about, everybody made fun of Clarence Thomas as a DEI selection of George Bush, but the thing about Clarence Thomas is he had an innate instinctual wisdom, cunning. He knew exactly where the traditionalist point of view was. He was very quiet. He didn't waste his ammunition on extraneous. And when he did speak and write, it was always predictably insightful, and he had the ability to get very, very good law clerks and help. And so she's not like that counterpart on the left, and she was put there to embody the left-wing interpretation of the court in a way even Sotomayor hasn't been able to do, or Kagan. That is, they see the court as an extension of the legislature, and they want to control it, and they don't feel bound by any prior tradition, protocol. It's just, except if it came from the Warren era. So they want to pack the court. They want to harass conservative judges at their homes. They're willing to do any and everything to stop this conservative traditionalist court and get rid of the Senate filibuster, bring in new states, get rid of the Electoral College. The whole movement of the Democratic Progressive is to destroy the idea of America as a republic, and anything that restricts the instant will of the people, so to speak, whether it's 2 senators that, they can represent as little as 250,000 people each in Wyoming by intent of the founders versus, 20 million here in California. They feel that's not fair. So they want to make the Senate like the House. They want to get 15 judges that they could appoint and instantly get a Democratic majority. They want to get rid of the Electoral College so voters in New York and Illinois and California can run the country. And part of that project is justices like Jackson that they feel they're a legislator, and their duty is to empower the left-wing agenda regardless of statute or prior rulings. And so she's the most left-wing of all the justices on the court. Maybe Sotomayor, but Sotomayor is a marginalized figure now, and she never really lived up to what she was billed at. As a general rule, the left gets hurt when it privileges race and gender, just because you limit the choices that you can bring to the fore. When you look at how the left had power on the court, and you look at past judges, Luke Powell or Brennan or that I said, Douglas or Warren, they were all very brilliant guys, and they were very smart, and they were white males. And I just don't see them nominating another left-wing distinguished white males, whereas the Republicans, who are not shackled by that, they not only can nominate a Scalia, they can get somebody like Alito, for example, or Gorsuch or Kavanaugh, that are distinguished and come up with some great defenses of constitutional government.
Democrats seem to be absolutely furious about the Supreme Court at the moment. As you say, it's sort of Republican, there's a Republican majority. They're talking about scrapping the Supreme Court, packing the Supreme Court. And the reason for this ostensibly is Roe versus Wade, abortion. This is the issue of the Democratic campaign in 2024. It was the issue they think they can win on. And again, when you speak to Democrat voters, that is one of the major issues that they talk about. Can you talk a bit about the history of the Supreme Court in the 20th century? I know that the Democrats dominated that court, that institution, for many, many years. So they seem to have lost that control, and they don't like that.
Well, the thing about the Democrats is all leftists. They have no sustained principle other than the acquisition of power to mandate government enforced equality. So at various times, the court should be independent, all-powerful, beyond politics. And that's when they had, as I said, not just justices like Powell and Brennan and Douglas and Warren but they had flipped everybody. It was just kind of known that if you nominated a David Souter, if you're George H.W. Bush, he would flip over to being left-wing, and they thought that was wonderful. They called that evolving. And so for them, the court was sacrosanct. When Reagan and Bush, the two Bushes, and Trump then were able to get true traditionalists, I'm not talking about John Roberts, but judges like Kavanaugh and Gorsuch and Comey Brown and Alito and Clarence Thomas, and get 5 of them, then all of a sudden the court was not a useful tool for the progressive project. So then they come in and say, it's okay, if you're Chuck Schumer and you're the Senate Minority Leader, you go to the doors of the Supreme Court and you basically threaten them. Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, you sowed the wind, you're going to reap the whirlwind. You do not know what's going to hit you. That unleashes subsequently demonstrations at the houses of the court justices, contrary to federal law that says you can't do that to influence an opinion. That starts a train of what's permissible by lowering the bar. So you can actually leak, contrary to, it's a felony to leak a Supreme Court brief before the ruling is published on Roe versus Wade to influence the 2022 midterm election, which it did. That means you lower the bar so an assassin can show up at Kavanaugh's home and call his sister and said, I want to shoot this guy. And if she hadn't reported him, he probably would have. And so in their way of thinking, any institution is useful and is sacrosanct as long as it's in our interest. And we will fabricate or use arguments that we have no shame in changing when it ceases to be useful. So before the 2016 election, they used to brag on what they called the blue wall. And you would pick up any Democratic pollster or political analyst. He says, I just don't think the Republicans are ever going to win, because before the voting even starts, you look at the Electoral College and you look at California, Illinois, New York. It's just not going to ever change. And more importantly, with immigration, especially illegal immigration, we have flipped New Mexico, Nevada, probably Georgia. We're working on Texas. And so they love the Electoral College. They loved it. They thought it was wonderful. They loved the Senate filibuster. They said it was a defense of mob rule of the Republicans. And then, of course, Barack Obama used the filibuster to filibuster the Alito appointment. Then when they gained the majority and the Republicans started to use the filibuster. Obama, the same person who had tried to filibuster Alito at the funeral of a distinguished civil rights leader, he hijacked his encomium, his eulogy, and he said, you know what? This is a racist holdover. We got to get rid of the filibuster. Same thing with states. In the old calculus, we always, going back to Civil War era, it was very contentious about letting in a state because each state had a particular political calculus. So the deal was that you let in one state, like in the modern era, the last two, you let in Hawaii, which was liberal, and then you let in Alaska at the same time frame. 2 senators conservative, 2 liberal. They say, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to get Puerto Rico in D.C. and get 4. Just as in the way that they want to get rid of the Electoral College, just the way they want to pack the Supreme Court because it's not the Warren Court, just the way they look at the border. They're deporting people from Cuba right now because they feel they come in the way that Hungarians did in the 1950s as fierce anti-communists. But they welcome in anybody else from that they feel is going to be a useful contingent. So I think we make a mistake about the modern left. It doesn't have a consistent ideology other than the retention and expansion of its power. And they don't really care about hypocrisy because they control the media and the institutions. So they say, if we're hypocritical or paradoxical, the media will take care of that. And it does.
But one of their major obsessions, you say they're not that ideological, is abortion and what they call reproductive rights. And this issue seems to be driving a lot of female voters. It looks like the Republicans have a lead with male voters, but a deficit with female voters. And female voters are more likely to vote. I think 10 million more women voted in 2020 than men. So how do Republicans tackle this issue of female voters and sort of, abortion itself?
Well, the only thing they can do, and I think that's what Vance was getting at in the debate, that they have to be better at it, is they have two, and this is what Trump was the only one in the debates, unlike DeSantis, for example, who made 2 points, that he was going to let the states decide. He was not going to have a state or national ban on a particular week, unless the states decided that. And then more importantly, he was going to allow, on both ends of the abortion spectrum, he was going to allow exemptions for rape and incest on the left end, and on the right end, he was going to bar late-term abortions in which the fetus or baby was viable outside of the womb and should not be aborted, in the last month and a half, at least. And that's where the American people are. If you look at polls, they do not approve the 8,000 to 10,000 late-term abortions. And when the left says they're very rare, because there's over 1 million abortions a year now in the United States, they haven't been effective in saying, yes, it's very rare, but killing 8,000 infants is not rare. And that's a lot of people. The other thing is, let the states decide. Last night in the debate, Walt said, well, she had to go all the way, this young woman who had as I understand it, a chemical abortion with a pill, and that did not dislodge the fetus, and she became infected. So she went to North Carolina, which was actually right across the border. It's not a distant planet or something, as he implied. But the point is, that is allowed under Georgia law. And most red states say that if it's a question of the serious life of a mother, then they should be allowed to have an abortion. And that's where the people are. And I think Vance understood that. There's one final thing that's very important, and that is we have a 1.5 to 1.6 fertility rate. It's dropped precipitously from the 1990s when it was well above Europe, 2.1, 2.2, without immigration. And so when we talk about, you noticed last night in the debate, the moderators insisted on using the word reproductive rights. They didn't use the word abortion. And Vance tried to use that correct term, and they don't like to use it. But what they need to do is change the dialectic. It's really reproductive rights. It's the right to not produce children when a person is pregnant. And there is consequences to that. And I think the Republicans, conservatives said, historically, a civilization that shrinks and ages is doomed. And so here we are championing the termination of 1 million young lives when the whole country is shrinking. We should, and that's what, actually, that's what Vance was trying to say. He said we need to encourage people to have children, economically, socially, culturally. I thought that was very good. But we shouldn't just say I'm pro-life or pro-choice. It's a reproductive agenda. They want to have the right to reproduce people, not reproduce. They don't want to reproduce.
Do you think this issue could swing it for the Democrats in November?
I don't think so, because most of the polls show that there's 3 to 4 issues that rate higher than abortion. The first, of course, is the economy. The second is usually the border. The third is either crime or the chaos abroad, and then we get to abortion. That was what was really intellectually dishonest about the moderators. So here they introduce 5 or 6 issues: global warming, health care, child care, of course, abortion. But they really didn't dwell very long in the Middle East, just 1 or 2 questions. They didn't bring up Ukraine. They did not bring up crime. They didn't bring up, they could have brought up the disastrous and tardy, lax response to Hurricane Helene. They didn't do that either. So they didn't bring up the longshoremen strike that threatens now to shut down the U.S. economy. Okay.
But they did bring up January 6th.
Yes, and they finished, of course, as everybody expected, on January 6th. I think that was the only weak point of J.D. Vance's otherwise superb performances. I would have said, look, in 2004, you people tried to decertify Ohio, and that was led by none other than Barbara Boxer, a U.S. Senator, who refused to tried to stop the certification and hijack that election. You people canonized Stacey Abrams, who said she had never really lost the Georgia governorship. You canonized her, even though she was an election denialist. You were the people on the January 6th committee that wouldn't even let Republican members be on it and destroyed a lot of the evidence after it was over. And then I would have said, in comparison to the riots that Kamala Harris said would not stop, should not stop, it's a movement, and tried to encourage people to bail out arsonists and assaulters. You, Mr. Waltz, watched your own city burn and this went on for 120 days and 35 deaths and $2 billion in damage, 1,500 officers, and none of you have ever apologized for it. And I think that would have been a very effective ending to that.
On young voters in America, interestingly, in Britain, young people are much more in favor of the Labour Party. Across Europe, it's more varied. Young people are voting for populist, nationalist parties. How do you assess the young vote in America? Is Donald Trump popular? Is Kamala brat or joyful, as they like to talk about? What's the sort of future of America looking like?
The youth vote is about 50-50, and it's bifurcated by gender, sex. Women are about 55-45, and men are about, for Harris, and the opposite is true for Trump. So what the subtext is a couple of things. It reflects the bifurcation in education. There's about half the country that goes heavily into debt, and they go to these universities and they do not get competitive degrees. They major or minor in gender studies, community studies, sociology, recreation, media studies, psychology. And then they leave college with enormous debts. They usually go to big cities. They prolong their adolescence. And they want cradle-to-grave government health care. They want debt relief for their loans. They want somebody to hire them. They believe in DEI, etc. All of the things they were indoctrinated at the universities. The other half of the country, and it's about 52%, doesn't believe that they're not going to go to college, and they're going into trades. A lot of them are disenchanted males, especially white males, that are demonized all the time as somehow culpable for these imaginary isms and ologies that they're accused of. 60% of college graduates are women, so they understand that women have a leg up on admissions and hiring, and they're demonized as predators, and they're getting very angry about it. A lost generation of males, especially white working class male, and they are overwhelmingly white working class males are about 70, under the age of 30, are about 70% pro-Trump. And when you look at it all, when you factor in all of these different constituencies, you get something that the Republicans had never quite enjoyed. It's about 52-48 for Harris, because, as you say, women will probably vote more than men. But there's also some things that we don't know how it's going to work out yet. That looks like that 45% of the Hispanic vote, higher maybe even than George W. Bush, may go to Trump. There's a possibility that 20% of the black vote, if that is true, that represents about 45% of black males under the age of 30 would vote for Trump. But I guess what I'm saying is there's just the nascent beginning of a male, not so much racial, but class, Hispanic, black, white working class, and they're sick and tired of being told they're illiberal, they're sexist, they're clueless, and they feel that all of the government programs that they pay taxes on are not helping them. They're going to this elite, and that the Democratic Party counts on. I would say that if you look at all of the campaigns that are now going on in the Senate and the House, whether it's the She Tester campaign in Montana or the Cruz campaign in Texas, there is a definite pattern, and that is all of these candidates on the left, given the trajectory of the Democratic Party, are not meeting with the press. They've been told to run out the clock. They've been told to moderate their positions for 90 days. They've been told to emulate the Harris-Walz approach. Do not get caught up on that they all voted for open borders, that they all cut the defense budget, that they're all secretly, they favor Palestine more than Israel, not to talk about the Green New Deal, or they want to ban natural gas. Don't talk about the Soros DAs, any of that. And so that tells me that they have no confidence in their agenda, because none of the policies that they have adopted poll, except for abortion, 51%. And that leaves them with kind of three choices to get elected, and they're not mutually exclusive. One is deny who you are, and don't talk to the media, and then revert to form after you're elected, after you fool the constituency. Or two, open the borders, and under this new protocol that 70% of the electorate doesn't show up on election day, and it's against the law in many states to ask for a driver's license, hope that a lot of people filter into the system and vote who are not citizens. That's another avenue. And then in addition to that, it is change the laws, change the system, try to change the court, try to change the filibuster, try to change the method that we vote, institutionalize early and mail-in voting, but attack the idea of a constitutional republic, electoral college, etc. So they don't like the system when it doesn't help them. They want new constituencies, and they want to disguise who they are, and that sums up perfectly the Harris campaign. On the other hand, if you look at what Trump and Vance are saying, it is close the border, go back to the melting pot, legal only immigration, measured, diverse, assimilation model, make it all over the world, but do not privilege Latin America any more than you would Europe or Asia or Africa or any other place. Make it meritocratic, not family connections, and then keep the institutions that have worked for 233 years, see them as sacred, and try to talk as much as you can to the people and inform them, do interviews, put on position papers on your website, and run for who you really are, because they look at polls and they see that most of the Americans are with them on the issues. So this is a very ironic time, because they keep telling us, the left, that democracy dies in darkness and that people are a threat to democracy. But when you look at the actual threat to democracy, my gosh, Donald Trump is the locus classicus. I mean, nobody's ever been impeached twice. Nobody's ever been tried as a private citizen. Nobody's been ever, in the case of 16 states, attempts made to remove his name from the state ballot. No one's been the object of 5 propped up indictments, civil, criminal suits, many of them coordinated with the White House legal counsel and the Biden Department of Justice. No one has ever had anything like the Russian collusion hoax of 2016, the 2020 disinformation hoax, the fusion between the FBI and social media in 2000. All these things are assaults on democracy, but they all reflect a general lack of confidence in the theme or the message.
Will the Democrats steal the election in November?
Well, I don't think they will, but when we say steal, that implies illegality. If you mean, will they rig the computers not to reflect the actual vote, or will they bus in a lot of fake ballots? I don't think they'll do that, but what I think they will do is they will count on the swing states to hone and focus these radical revolutionary changes that we don't appreciate that took place in 2020 under the COVID ruse. In other words, a team of Democratic lawyers went into Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia, Arizona. They sued, they cherry-picked judges, and they said that ballots didn't have to always match the registrar's list, that corrupt names or partial names were valid, that addresses didn't have to be entirely accurate, that ballots could be mailed in 10 days after, that ballots could be harvested by third parties going to a house, that people could register the same day and vote, that ballots could be cured. So if a ballot was considered fraudulent, then the candidate of which would be the beneficiary could come in up to 10 days, call up the constituent and said, go in there and then fill it out the way you should have the first time. All of that was new, and it really changed that 2020 election. I don't know if that you call that illegal or legal, but that's where we are now. And the degree to which Trump or Vance will win will be the degree whether they not whine about it or try to beat it in court. You can't, but emulate it and master it and do the same thing to them that they're doing to the conservatives. And the preliminary results show that if you look at registrations, even after the Taylor Swift endorsement and the dropping of Biden, where the Democrats got a lot of rushed registrations, it looks like in Pennsylvania and in Georgia and in Arizona and Wisconsin, Michigan, there are more Republican voters registered than there were Republican voters registered in 2020.
Well, I tell you what, one of the most eye-opening and shocking things for me reading about American political history is just how corrupt your elections have been. Look at the 1948 Lyndon Johnson Senate race. Look at the 1960 presidential election. It's just extraordinary to me, as a naive, person about America, just how much corruption there's been in your democracy.
Yeah, it's mostly, not always, but it always takes place in big cities that are controlled by Democrats. That's exactly what Mayor Daley, I think you could argue, stole the 1960 election for JFK. And we know what New York has been like. We know what Detroit is like. In Philadelphia in the 2008 election, we had a precinct that voted 30,000 to 1 for Obama. That was statistically impossible. But it's mostly, it's kind of subtle. The American theme is that the right has all the power and money, and they're the aristocratic party, so the left should be given indulgence for finding any ways necessary for the noble end of the people. That's no longer true, because they're the party of wealth and influence and power and arrogance, but that still is enshrined. And so it's very hard. I mean, if you say that there is election stealing or interference, then you're met with, you're a racist, you're a sexist, you're a xenophobe. But we know that that's just, they kind of cynically assume that there is going to be that. They write books with titles, Demography is Destiny, New Democratic Majority. Then you say, yeah, I understand. And they say, oh, you're for the Great Replacement Theory. It's very hard. Europe, it's very also a final irony is they always look toward Europe. They always tell us, we've got to do what Europe does. Europe has mass transit. Europe has apartment living. Europe doesn't have the wasteful country 1 acre ranch house. Europe doesn't commute 60 miles in your car. They're so sophisticated. But Europe has paper one-day ballots. It works very well. You go in, you have to show an ID. In most European countries, you vote, and they manage to count just like we used to in one day. By midnight, the votes, maybe the next morning, they're all in. There's no fraud. And they have a large number of migrants, and they have a very strong left wing that fights that, and yet their traditions are strong enough that they're able to stop that. But, you know, this country is, there's a lot of things going on in this country that people don't appreciate. We have 60 million people that were not born in the United States, and that's the highest in a percentage and in total numbers that we've ever had. California, which is the model for that, 27% of the population was not born in the United States. And the Democratic Party sees that as their last salvation, and they're encouraging that, and they're changing laws to the extent they can to facilitate that. And they've given, I mean, we've got a very bizarre propaganda, and it works suddenly like if you're a poor, exploited victim of Mexican racism by elites in Mexico City, and you live in Oaxaca or Chiapas or Michoacan, and you manage to get to the United States, your destination of opportunity and fairness where you're going to be treated with dignity, you cross that border, and the next day the left says you've been a victim, you're eligible for affirmative action, your kids should be given preference, you're part of the DEI collective that it's been historically, and all of a sudden the illegal alien who just arrived here, we don't say he's a victim of Mexican corruption, racism, oppression, and a sick system. We say, oh my God, we've treated him so badly. And that's what the left does. And they always do that, but it's been very effective. The only hope that I have is that we got rid of the Marquess of Queensberry, Bush, McCain, Romney rules, that they would rather lose nobly than win ugly.